Well, welcome to the May edition of the Brandwood Biomedical webinar. This morning's webinar will be Documentation Deconstructed, Understanding the Technical File. My name is Bennett and I'm the CEO of Brandwood Biomedical based in Sydney, Australia. Today I'm joined by TJ Thiel, who's a Principal Consultant and our Consulting Manager here in Sydney. A few housekeeping rules before we get stuck in this morning. Remember that if you've got a question throughout the webinar, please, you'll notice the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Be sure to post your questions. We'll be monitoring those throughout this webinar. And hopefully we get those answered for you throughout today's webinar, and if we don't, we'll have time at the end to run through any sort of specific questions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across now to TJ to run through today's webinar.
Hello, everybody. Thank you again for joining us on this May edition of the Brandwood Biomedical webinar. Really appreciate the attendance, and I know that this is a very hot topic and something that all medical device and IVD manufacturers are keenly aware of, and we want to make sure that we present some information that's helpful to you. But again, to Grant's point, if you have questions, we will do our best at the end of the presentation to address those. If we don't get time or we run out of time, we will make sure to follow up with anyone who provides a question after the webinar is completed. As always, the webinar will be recorded and it will be available on the Brandwood Biomedical website after the webinar is complete. So feel free to download and listen to it again if you need to, but hopefully you'll catch enough from it during the conversation today. So in front of us, we have the agenda. Effectively, we want to start off by just describing what a technical file is and why do we need it. That's going to be helpful because I think, in documentation for medical device and IVD manufacturers, the set of documentation that you put together and, what that documentation means and what it's used to support is sometimes clear, but often, we get lost in the, shuffle of what is truly documentation towards a technical file and what's just the general documentation to create. From there, we want to go into the technical file and how it's related to the DHF and the DMR. DHF being design history file, DMR is the device master record. These are two very US-centric topics or abbreviations, but it's important to note this so that you understand how building a single technical file that is, fully encompassing may allow you to meet multiple regulatory burdens when you go to do applications across the world. Next thing we're going to discuss is how the technical file is related to a regulatory submission. Again, we're going to have a bit of a US focus here because we want to show in a specific example how the technical file content is translated into a 510K specifically. Next, we're going to just describe, or try to put to bed the concerns or the questions that people have as to what the heck is the difference between a design dossier and a technical file. And that's a pretty simple question to answer, so we'll just do that. And then the last thing is, and I think the major point that we can push on today is the considerations for the MDR transition. Now, with the MDR coming into place and IVDR for that matter, there are some more documentation things that we want to address as medical device manufacturers and want to make sure that our technical file covers in order to be compliant with that MDR as it's put forward in May 2020. So with that, we'll get started. So basically, a technical file is really the product-specific documentation to show the design and development of your device meets the quality management system requirements. That's the bottom line. It's as simple as a set of documents that basically show that you're doing design and development aligned with your quality management system. Now, as medical device manufacturers, as IVD manufacturers, we have standards that we must comply to with our quality management system. So by ensuring that your technical file is aligned with your QMS, it will also be aligned with those standards. And that goes into the next point. Why do we need the technical file? Well, simply, ISO 13485 suggests that you absolutely need to establish a technical file for your medical device. And in addition, and this is no surprise to anyone out there, regulators require the documentation within the technical file for submissions, whether it's resides on file for future review in lower classification devices, or it's something that needs to be presented as part of an active review for those higher classification devices. So that's the nitty-gritty of what a technical file is. Now let's talk about how that relates to a DHF and a DMR. As we described earlier, a DHF is the design history file, and that's the full description of the design, including any key documents and many project management records. So this is really how you developed and designed your device. This is the collection of documentation that shows the process of and all of the considerations in the design and development of your device. The DMR is really focusing on documentations around the process of manufacturing. So these are the manufacturing specific documents that reside within the technical file that suggest how the device is to be manufactured so that it matches up with those DHF requirements. Again, these are two separate sets. Now, they all reside within the technical file, but as we see from regulators and what needs to be presented in active applications, they are different in the content that they have. If we look at the design and development process that the FDA has in just about every one of their presentations, in their guidances, so on and so forth, we really look at the design and development waterfall. Again, this is to describe the overall process of design and development, from user needs to inputs to process to outputs and to an actual completion of a medical device, with how it's tied into verification and validation. If we think about input specifically, we're talking about the product requirement documents. Those documents that describe the requirements of your product to meet not only the user needs, but the overall intent of your product. Outputs, these are the specifications that show that the inputs, or show how the inputs are met. So these are product specifications, including drawings, BOMs, so on and so forth. If we go into risk management, which is the overall, per ISO 14971, the overall idea that we've controlled risk in the product and that the risk-benefit ratio is met in the creation of the product. The risk management really covers the risk analysis, traceability, things like your DFMEA, your PFMEA, any hazard analysis. Those are the types of things that would be in your risk management documentation. Next, we go into verification records. As you can see in the waterfall the FDA provides, the verification is meant to be a check of those design inputs. So are you building what you said you're going to build? And how you do that is by compiling documentation that includes test data, certificates, internal testing, analytical bench testing, raw data from your lab books, things like that. Those are the content of what you're going to use to supply, a regulator when they ask for verification information. Lastly, we have the validation records. Again, remember, validation is to prove that the product meets the intended need of the end user. So these are the real use scenarios and the real testing of clinical use and the clinical trial design and all of those evaluation reports and records that are related to the use of the device as it's to be used by the end user. Again, validation can include those clinical trials. It can include your CER, which may not have direct clinical trials, but may include a establishment against a comparative device. It may include your post-market surveillance. It also may include usability information. So that's how the design process and the DHF are kind of combined. And then the last thing, and this is kind of the overarching, the thing that ties this all together, is the project management. Again, the expectation of the regulator is that at every stage, there is some type of review so that you have an understanding as to where you're progressing with the design and development of your device, but that you've addressed all of the required documentation and any of the risks that are associated with each of those stages of development. So how do you show that? You show that with your overall project management plan. You show that with design, your meeting records. So when your XFT meets and has conversations about this, you also show it with your design reviews. So when you actually take the XFT, you talk about it and you decide that this document or this protocol, whatever it happens to be, is suitable for the design and development of the device. That's signed off by the XFT. That's your design review. And then finally, design transfer, those kind of things as it's being pushed into manufacturing. That leads me to this next one, which is really the link between the DHF and the DMR. So as we talk about the creation of this DHF, we've really talked about the design and development of the product and how the inputs and outputs and the verification and validation activities have created a suitable medical device for manufacturing that will meet the intended purpose. So as we transfer that into the DMR, which is again the device master record, we really talk about three things need to be there. The first one is the specifications. We need to know what the drawing is, and that drawing is locked in through design and development and is frozen so that you have a specific way to build your device every single time. And then in addition to that, you have a bill of materials, because as you know, each of these pieces of each of these components or subcomponents of your medical device may have multiple subcomponents that build all together, make your medical device whole, and that's where it's captured in the BOM. Your production procedures, again, you want to be able to show that you can manufacture this repeatably and to the requirements that you set forward in the drawings. So you need to have SOPs and work instructions to describe how that production procedure or how that production's done. And then, you also need to show that you have a check on that. So any of your QC test methods, your sampling, your release criteria, your inspection criteria, those types of things need to be included in your production procedures so that it shows that you are able to have control over the manufacturing process. And then finally, as an overarching kind of requirement for the DMR, you need to really make sure that your equipment has been validated and process validated through the manufacturing process as well. These are the documents like your IQ, your OQ, your PQ, things like that. And then any kind of tolerance and special environmental controls need to be considered here. So do you need to build this in a clean room because it's a sterile product? Or do you need to have additional considerations for pest control or things that may create risk to your product? These are all things that need to be established and documented in the DMR. Okay, so we've talked about DHF and DMR. One other document that comes up, especially in regulatory submissions, is the STED. And the STED is the Summary of Technical Documentation. So what is that? And really, it's a compilation or a collection of technical documents. It's not full technical documents. No, this is a key aspect of the STED. It's really meant to be the summary document so that a regulator can get a very good picture of the design and development and any verification validation activities that you've completed for your device in one simple location. And so that collection of technical documents will include, any description around the device design, your risk management strategy, plan, report, any of the hazard analysis, FMEAs, things like that, your testing and clinical validation, and then any manufacturing summary. So that is the content that goes into that STED. And like I said, ultimately, in that STED, you are trying to show evidence that your device complies with the regulations. So if anything comes out of your STED, you should be able to make the statement that you have met the safety and efficacy required for this device to be effective in what it's trying to do. That it's performing as it intended, and again, that it's manufactured under appropriate control so that there's no question that, as you manufacture this on a regular basis, that it will be the same device in a controlled manner. As we talk about creating that STED, like I suggested before, it's not full documentation. It's really these summaries and data subsets of 4 key attributes that go into the STED. And those attributes are the intended uses and technical specs. So really, what is the driver of this device, and from the specification side, how do you show that this device is what it is? The device description, again, understanding as you take in the intended use, the indications for use, and what the device does. This is that device description so that a regulator understands that when they go in to review the STED and the regulatory submission, overall. Then probably the most important part, and the one that gets the most scrutiny by the regulators, is your validation and verification data. Again, because there's some interpretation and it's all based on your risk assessment as to what you need to verify and validate, that's why the regulators spend most of their time looking at this section of the STED. And it's important to know that you need to include enough information that a regulator can come away from reviewing that set of data between your verification and validation data to say, yes, I believe that the company, the manufacturer, has proven the safety and effectiveness of this device has been met. And then finally, you want to talk about the process and the production documentation. So really summarizing the process, summarizing those steps, having a flow chart to show the manufacturing process flow, and any of the inspections or controls that you've put in place to manage that production is key here. So this is where you really want to push on the fact that not only do you have a manufacturing process that gives you what you have intended to build, but you have controls along the way to prove that. And that's, once you have those pieces, and again, you'll have full documentation in your technical file, you're going to take those data subsets and put them into the STED. And that's the key document and one of the major documents that the regulators review. It wouldn't be right for us to not mention that there are regulatory specific documents that you need to consider when you create your technical file. And I think, as Brandwood is, a regulatory consultancy, this is where we spend a lot of time working with our clients and educating them on not only the overall regulatory requirements, but also those geography-specific requirements that are needed. Now, in order to build the right technical file, you really want to have an establishment of the markets that you're looking to go to. It may not be those immediate markets that you want to launch in, but it may be where you might go in a year, in 5 years, in whatever the time frame is. Because ultimately, you can create that set of documentation that includes those specific geographical regulatory requirements at the beginning and be efficient so that when you do decide to move into those regulatory pathways or into specific geographies, that you have that documentation existing. So we've put 5 categories of these specific regulatory documents, and I just want to walk through each of these because I want to give you some geographic and regulatory specific examples for each. So the first one is details of manufacturing critical suppliers. As we outsource more and more of our manufacturing process, and we have more and more manufacturers that become critical to the supply of our device, that is, the regulators are looking more and more in that. Remember, you have to show control of your supplier, and often regulators expect you to show control of your supplier's supplier. So in this case, there may be requirements from, say, TGA, from FDA, that if you have a critical supplier who is absolutely critical to your device, and when I mean critical, they provide an absolute necessity for your device to be created in such a way that it meets your intended purpose or intended use, those are things that they're going to address and they are going to review. So they may want to see instances of ISO certifications. They're definitely going to want to see that you have them on your approved supplier list and that you have a supplier agreement or quality agreement with that manufacturer. And you may need to think about how you're doing regular audits and checks of that supplier. we cannot be in a situation where the only check that we have of a critical manufacturer is our incoming inspection. The regulators are not accepting that as control of supplier. You need to have all these other pieces so that you have a proactive responsibility for the control of your device. The next one is the declarations of conformity. Again, the content of declarations of conformity, no matter what the geography is pretty consistent. Basically, it describes the device, it describes the manufacturer, it describes the standards that you comply to. The only difference is that some geographies, such as Australia, Europe, have different templates in which they want to see this data. So again, creating that original set of data will make it not only easy for you to do that at the same time for any potential geographies, but if you decide that at a later point you want to move forward and go into Australia, for instance, it's a simple edit and a new template to put that information in your DOC into. Device classification statement. As we know, as much as we love every geography and every regulator to be harmonized, that hasn't happened yet. And so we have classification differences between the jurisdictions and the regulatory bodies. So one instance or one example would be the TGA has a special classification for anything that's in the cardiac or near the coronary or cardiac envelope. Those are things that automatically get classified as class 3 in Australia. They may not be class 3 in Europe or the US. And so having a regulatory strategy or a classification document that describes how you've made that classification determination, but also, met the requirements and can show the specific clauses of the guidances that you have created that classification with is key. Product history, as we have more and more products that are iterations of previous products on the market, it is absolutely critical for you to describe the product history. So if this is truly a new product that it's never been done by you and you've never had anything, you're not going to have a product history, and that's not the end of the world. But in the situation where you have a product on the market and this is what you term as an upgrade or an advancement in the technology, you want to be able to show the differences between those two devices and give that regulatory history for a regulator to look at. If you have years and years and years of experience of your previous device on the market and you've not had any major issues with it, you should be using that to support your safety and effectiveness claims for your new device. No, it's not the whole thing, but it's really going to paint a picture for the regulator that suggests you as a company know what you're doing, you can do it well, you have the controls in place, and that your previous history demonstrates that. And then the last one is the essential requirements checklist. Again, the content of these between like Europe and Australia aren't tremendously different. There is a different template, there is a different nomenclature to them. EP checklist in Australia, ER checklist currently with the MDD in Europe, moving to the GSPR, I believe, GSPR. The content of those are not completely unique. Now, you do have to analyze each individual line item specific to the regulation because there is some wording changes. But again, setting up a technical file that is robust, that has all of this information in a complete manner will make that process quite easy, and it almost becomes an administrative task. Okay? So we talked about the DHF, the DMR. We talked about a STED. We talked about the regulatory documents that we create specific to geography, specific to regulators. The result is your technical file. Ta-da. So this list here that you see on the slide is really an overall and a high-level list of the things that we would expect in a technical file. Now, as you have more and more information and you have specific types of devices, you will have more content in your technical file. I mean, for instance, software, which many of you guys have in your device, is not listed here. That doesn't mean that it's not needed. So again, this is meant to be a high-level summary of what needs to be in the technical file and how you implement that for your product-specific applications or your product-specific technical file. You'll need to do a little bit more of an assessment around that. But that's a pretty good starting point. If we think about, and I told you before when we started and talked about the agenda, I wanted to relay this back to a real world example. So as we have a technical file, how do we fit that all together for a 510K? So if we start, there are things that are consistent between both. So administrative information, so these are the things about your manufacturers, your key vendors, so on and so forth. That's not unique to the 510K, it's not unique to the technical file. Documentation can be used in both. Your device, the overview of your device, so your device description and kind of those input and output documents, and your production processes, those again are not unique, so can be used to support your 510K as well. As we start talking about the technical file, there are 3 documents that are created as part of that technical file that aren't necessarily required in the 510K. It does not mean that that content will not be used in other things, and I'll try to show you that here in a second. But things like your declaration of conformity and classification, your conformity assessment certifications, and any essential requirements, checklists, essential principle checklist, GSPR checklist, those would be included in your technical file. Again, I'll show you here in a second that pieces of those will be used to support your 510K filing. Then you have the majority of your DHF, things like your design plan, your risk management file, your inputs, your protocols, your testing, your verification, your clinical evaluation reports, clinical trials, things like that. Part of your DHF, they sit in your technical file, but again, they will be translated into specific 510K deliverables. And then finally, your DMR, again, the last piece of the full technical file, the production-specific SOPs and work instructions, your equipment specs, your inspection release protocols, things like that that are in the DMR will be within your technical file, and pieces of those may be used to support questions that you get from the regulator or the FDA in a 510K. But I will show you here how these translate into 510K deliverables right now. So again, 510K has some unique deliverables, just like the DOC and the ER checklist. They have a cover letter, they have a truthful and accurate statement, and they have a 510K summary. 510K summary is often created as a subset of the STED that you have in your technical file. Then we talk about the risk analysis summary. That is really taken directly from the DHF deliverable of your risk management file. So that is a one-to-one and often requires very little adaptation for use in the 510K. Then you also have your indications for use statement and your substantial equivalence discussion. Those are things that are taken from majority of your design inputs, your verification and validation activities. So your CER will be a huge part of what you end up putting into your substantial equivalence discussion. So creating a good CER, which just a couple months ago, Ham and I from Brandwood provided a webinar on CERs. Having a good and a bulletproof CER is critical to creating subsequent documentation such as the substantial equivalence discussion. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of how we tie a technical file to a regulatory submission. So there's just a couple other things, and I'm going to get very Europe specific here for a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that I address these because they are constant or common questions that we get from clients that are creating technical documentation for their medical device. So technical file versus design dossier. But basically, the terms, although they're not completely interchangeable, are often used interchangeably. Really, design dossier becomes a unique thing when it's specific to a classification or when it's called out in the MDR in a specific annex of that. Also, some notified bodies in higher classification devices consider it design dossier. However, just remember this, if you create your technical file effectively for the classification of your device, You're going to have the same content. Okay, now here's the big one, MDR. Now we all are frantically getting ready for this, and so I wanted to put a few considerations into the presentation today, just to make sure that we talked about this and had some comments around this. Now, the first thing I'm going to mention is that because of time, I didn't get into the IVDR. Just remember that the IVDR this time around is very similar in the content of the MDR. Now, I'm not saying it's identical, so don't take me as saying that. But the general requirements and the general considerations that we're presenting here are something that should be considered in the creation of IVDR documentation. We at Brandwood realize that we have clients that are in both the MDR and IVDR space. And we are going to move forward and make sure that the IVD diagnostic companies are also supported in the same manner. So in a future webinar, we will be 100% diagnostic focused. So we will make sure that we will have that kind of conversation in the next couple of months. In addition, on the back of this presentation, we will put together a blog post that will not only be on our website, but will be included in our first Tuesday newsletters that will discuss the specific documentation requirements for the IVDR. Again, I appreciate all of you that are on the line that are in the diagnostic space. I was there for the last 10 years, so I totally understand your concerns and your considerations. So I want to make sure that you guys are supported, and that's why we will put together a blog and a webinar specific to the IVD concerns. That being said, let's discuss the MDR. And again, some of these concepts and considerations are consistent with what will be in the IVDR as well. So as we all know, the MDR is set for implementation on 26 May 2020. With that, there are some considerations on the documentation. So the first one is the idea of the GSPR. So remember that the essential requirements checklist is really getting replaced by the GSPR, and those are set out in Annex 1 of the MDR. And effectively, just like the ER checklist, you need to make sure that your technical documentation addresses those requirements and provides requisite evidence for compliance. So just like you would with the ER checklist currently under the MDD, you are going to create your checklist. You are going to provide whether that requirement is applicable or not applicable. If it's applicable, you need to provide evidence through documentation, references that you comply and have met that requirement. Okay. The next one, because the MDR is really going to change things when it comes to classifications, you need to make sure that your technical documentation will also support the new classification of your device. So the example that I'll point out here is if you had a class 1 device right now that was self-declared, that you had internal documentation, but you were happy with the content and you felt that it supported that level of risk, you need to then reassess that and really drive into the details as to, is this enough? Do I need to bolster my technical file to have additional considerations for the new classification? That may require additional testing, unfortunately. You may have to look at your risk management file and say, we need to have more mitigation around these risks. And therefore, you may have to go back to the well and do some more verification, some lab testing, maybe even a clinical study. Now, hopefully it doesn't come to that, and hopefully you can create a CER that will address that appropriately, but even the revision of the CER needs to be considered if your device is being changed in the classification.
TJ, just to add to that, and I guess as a question as well, considerations for other international approvals that are based on your European approvals. We're seeing a lot of, communications coming out of the Australian regulator, Therapeutic Goods Administration, that are starting to question that alignment to the Europeans. How should a company take that into consideration with the implementation of MDR? and how would you sort of see that flow onto other regulatory approvals?
Yeah, so with the exception of the actual regulatory pathways themselves, and we can get into that in a second, I think this is where, again, you kind of play to the highest classification in the creation of your technical file. So what I mean by that is, if let's say your device is being up-classified by the MDR to a class 3, but it remains a class 2 in the US or Europe or excuse me, Australia or Canada or whatever, you would want to make sure that your documentation, the overall technical file supports that higher classification. Now, that means that when you actually have to do the regulatory pathways, it does create some friction between the two pathways. So Australia, for instance, will have, you will need to really consider how you're going to apply, given that it's not the same classification and that your CE mark is for a different classification of device. But your technical file will be supportive of wherever you're going to go, because you basically played to the most risk, the highest classification, and by creating that technical file in such a manner, all of the lower classification areas will be addressed. Next one to mention here, and we've touched on this before, and like I said, we had a webinar on this completely 2 months ago on the CER, but the CER is becoming more and more scrutinized by the notified bodies as not only in the ramp up towards MDR, but we know it will be when the MDR is implemented. So really ensuring that the CER is completed per MedDev 2.7/1 Rev 4 so that your clinical data is captured. Now, it's not going to change whether you have a requirement for clinical data. Unless you're up-classified where there's an expectation that clinical data, direct clinical data on your device is needed, the CER is still the way to establish your safety and effectiveness profile by using, one, comparative devices, having those equivalent devices and using their post-market, their history, their publications to support your device. That's one way. Two, any post-market surveillance data that you're getting. Now, this is a big one because not only do we know that the MDR is changing and being more scrutinizing around the PMS information, but we know that there are guidances coming from TGA. We know there's more scrutiny at the FDA in the post-market surveillance piece. So this is something that updating your CER to ensure that all of your post-market surveillance data, not only the stuff that you report to the regulators, but also the complaints that you hold internally, is captured within that CER. And then the other two big things here are your literature search, making sure that that's done under a protocol that would be acceptable by the guidance of MedDev 2.7/1, and having a state-of-the-art assessment. Really ensuring that your device and the literature that's out there for equivalent devices prove state-of-the-art for your device. Those are the big key contributing factors to a good CER. If you put those together in that manner with the classification of the device that you have, that's going to be your recipe for success. The next thing, Annexes 2 and 3 of the MDR must be addressed with the appropriate documentation if they're applicable. And then last one, not to say that it's the elephant in the room, but it's the train in the tunnel that we can see the light and we're trying to desperately get out, is the UDI system. And as that becomes applicable, there is going to be requirements that everything must be aligned with the system in the UDI per Article 27 of the MDR. One thing, and I actually want to step back, with the eventuality of UDIMED and the database for complaints in Europe, I think that's another consideration that manufacturers must take when they're doing their CER review. So as that's implemented, as that's put into place, UDIMED will be something that is an expectation of the notified body as part of your CER. So just wanted to step back because I didn't address that the first time. Okay, so those are the biggest considerations of the MDR. there are a couple of just general manufacturing considerations that we need to make as well. Much like you would for ISO 1345 in designating a responsible party for your quality management system, you need to do the same as it comes to your regulatory compliance. So effectively, there needs to be somebody who is responsible for that. Now, it can be a position, it can be, it could be a specific person, but you need to designate that person within your documentation to show that they are going to maintain compliance of your documentation and technical file. The second one, it tends to be a little bit more for foreign manufacturers looking to sell into Europe, but is worth mentioning, and that's the expectation of the authorized rep to have all technical documentation readily available. Now, I say readily available because it's different than reasonably available. TGA will give you a fair amount of time to find that documentation. Although there isn't any defined timeline for when documentation needs to be able to be provided to a competent authority or a notified body from the authorized rep, the expectation is that that is, within 24 to 48 hours. So it is key, especially as a legal manufacturer outside of Europe, that your authorized rep holds enough information. Now, they don't have to have the whole technical file, and this is where it behooves manufacturers to have appropriate agreements in place with their authorized rep so that they can hold a subset or the full technical file to support any requests that come from the competent authority in an expedient manner. Okay, so again, you are still the one who dictates, the documentation that gets put into the technical file, but it does create challenges because as you update documents in your technical file, you need to make sure that that's communicated to your authorized rep, and that's something we haven't done before. We've really been in a situation where the authorized rep is really there to help with post-market activities and to address complaints and to make sure that those are triaged per the European requirements. Now, there is an expectation that that documentation will lie with the authorized rep so that if a notified body wants to review that because they've gotten a complaint or they've seen trending, that they can look at your documentation to either suggest that you need to do additional activities or to kind of dismiss it for your specific product. That needs to be readily available. Okay. So in summary, and we'll spend some time on questions here in a bit, but I just want to briefly go through the content of this presentation now. Your technical file is truly a compilation of technical and regulatory information. Again, not just about your device, not just about your device's manufacturing, not the specifications of your device, it's all of it. It is a fully encompassing technical file that includes any regulatory information. Creating a technical file that addresses any potential regulatory authorities or regulatory approvals that you're looking to get is a great activity to have at the beginning of any project. So as you start to create your project development plan and you say to yourself, okay, well, where can we see this being marketed? If you have any inkling that you might end up in a different market or a different regulatory, with a regulatory approval somewhere else, address it up front. That way you can ensure that any documentation and any geography-specific information is created as part of that full technical file. Next, the content of the technical file is drawn from your DHF, which again is your design history file, your DMR, your design master record, which is basically your production documentation around the device, and your regulatory and administrative. Again, regulatory being any regulations that you need to comply with in current state or future state, and then administrative documentation, really giving the full context of who your suppliers are, who your vendors are, things like that. The technical file must provide evidence to regulatory compliance. Again, standards are out there because the use of those standards and consensus standards is getting more and more obvious from the regulators. So providing that evidence to show that you're compliant to specific standards, or that you comply to specific guidances or annexes or whatever it happens to be, make sure that's within your technical file and it's spelled out explicitly. You do that a lot with your essential principles, your essential requirements, your GSPR, but having that evidence of all of this, the regulatory compliance is key. Every device needs one. So again, this is not, it's not a nice to have, and it's not a, well, we've got a couple of documents, so that's a technical file. No, ISO 13485 requires that there is a technical file created for every medical device. In addition, any regulator that, if you have a medical device that's regulated by any regulator, they're going to expect a technical file to support that. Again, we've touched on this before. I can hammer home on this as many times until I'm blue in the face, but the bottom line is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So if you have a really careful and considerate creation of the technical file, and you really outline your strategy and your plan, and you have documents that suggest the deliverables that are going to meet each of these individual requirements of the technical file, that is the best way to go about this. Now, I know sometimes we get technical files, or we've acquired companies that have poor technical files, or you're working with legacy products that the technical file isn't necessarily there. There are opportunities for you to be efficient, but really sitting down and having a plan of action and how you're going to go about this so that you serve multiple market requirements. And again, this goes back to not only where you want to launch today, but where you might want to launch in the future. That's key to a technical file creation. Again, the technical core, so the information is not unique to any one geography. The consistent thing that I'll push on also is that you will create common technical documents that will be used in every one of your submissions. So having robust documentation, having documentation that not only supports, that supports all the geographies that you have within your plan and any specific requirements they have, whether that's specific verification requirements, whether that's meeting CTD requirements, whatever. Having that common technical core that is robust and can fulfill all of those geography requirements is key. And then, as you know, there is local variations on regulatory documents. If you create a technical core that is robust, creating those local variations will be easy. And well, easy with an asterisk by it. But it will be something that is a lot easier than starting from scratch. So like I said, it's very easy to draw the comparison between an EP checklist and the ER checklist. That's obvious. But as we start talking about what I need to create for a 510K, that summary of safety and effectiveness for the 510K summary, that's documentation that I can take from my STED. And I can, do a lot of cut and paste. Now, obviously review it, make sure the content is still, specific to meet the FDA requirements. But again, you put together the right documentation up front, you will be able to do less work and be much more efficient in creating those regulatory documents that are specific to local variations and local regulators. And last, just make sure you consider the MDR. It's coming, we can't avoid it. As much as we'd like to hide from it, it's not a possibility. So really, those considerations that we put into these slides, and again, these slides will be available, make sure that they're addressed in your technical file documentation. Okay? So that's what I had for a presentation today. I've tried to leave ourselves about 10 minutes for some questions, and we've gotten some questions ahead of time. We've got a couple in online as we've been speaking. Again, please feel free to ask more, and you can submit those using the Q&A button on your computer. But if you come up with something afterwards, so you digest this information, you go, oh my goodness, I forgot to ask this. Don't worry, you can always email us. help@brandwoodbiomedical.com. We will personally respond to every email that we get for, on these webinars. And if there's any information we can provide, we're certainly happy to do that.
Thanks, TJ. So a couple of questions. We've got a few minutes. Got a question from Ramit. Is it still the EP checklist or is it the GSPR?
Yeah, again, so I think he means ER checklist, because again, we're talking about Europe here in the MDR, but EP checklist is not going to change for Australia. There isn't I don't think there's any consideration on that. But as the MDR has been implemented, there is a movement to this GSPR conversation. Now, content of that GSPR is located in Annex 1 of the MDR, so that's easy enough. But again, I don't believe the content is terribly unique. Now, there are some unique things in it, and you need to be able to address those individually, but the majority of what you're putting together for an ER checklist will be something that you can put into the GSPR checklist.
Okay. I do have a question from an anonymous person, whether or not we're actually going to send a recording of the webinar. We are. Email will come out. This is recorded and will be about for download on our website as well. Danica has sent a question. What information is expected in a technical file for procedure packs where components are sourced from various suppliers and manufacturers?
Oh, that's an excellent question, Danica. So as I alluded to earlier, more and more legal manufacturers of medical devices are outsourcing specific manufacturing processes. Now, that may be inline manufacturing, so maybe just a process step on your final device. It may actually be components that are put together into your device, or it could be components that go into a kit. So the bottom line is you need to make sure that you have enough documentation to support a full technical file. And like I said, what that really comes back to is that you have the documentation to support your inputs, your outputs, your specific verification, well, mostly around the risk management file. So if you have risks and you have to use mitigation through verification and validation of your component supplier, you need to make sure that you bring those in to your technical file. Now, I know that's a difficult situation because often we get agreements with manufacturers that believe their stuff is proprietary. They don't want to hand over that. That's okay, as long as they know that and through supplier and quality agreements that they need to have that accessible to a regulator should they ask. Now, again, you need to be confident with that information being there so that you can appropriately assess the risk, because that risk file is yours and will never be anybody else's, but that any of the documents that you need are in there, and that appropriate considerations are also made into your labeling, your IFU, so on and so forth.
Thanks, TJ. Another question from Ian. How do you handle a paperless system where documents are not intended to be printed? So 21 CFR controls, etc.
Yeah, another great question. So we're now getting into a situation where paper is becoming less and less the standard. 20 years ago when I started doing this, I don't think I had anything stored on any hard drive or anything, and it was all paper-based, and that was the source of truth, as we used to say. Ultimately, that's changing, and there are plenty, and I would say most of the off the shelf, out of the box, QMS management softwares will provide some certificate or some validation to show that they meet 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. Now, we partner with, and we've actually provided blogs to companies like Master Control, which have a 21 CFR Part 11 compliance declaration. So the big thing is ensuring that they have that. If they don't, then you need to make sure that there's some validation of the documentation record system. Now, biggest things here, and these are the things that I'll tell you in personal experience with notified body reviews and auditing recently. The biggest things that they're pushing in this space: cybersecurity, document retention, so the actual time that they're going to be retained, and disaster recovery. Really understanding if your cloud-based system goes down, How long is it down for? Is there a local backup? So on and so forth. These are all the considerations that you should have in your quality management system that apply to the old technical file itself. Okay.
Thanks, TJ. Another question from Anonymous. Will design review documents be part of the technical file or only part of the design history file?
So again, this is a nomenclature question. So ultimately, the technical file includes the DHF and the DMR. So ultimately, your documentation, so design review documents, will be included in the DHF, but that effectively is the technical file as well.
We've got only a couple of questions and a few more minutes left before we wrap up. One question, I think you've actually covered this, but is it normal to have different product specifications for USA submissions and a separate one for EU submissions?
Realistically, it's not often that you would want to have two product specifications for a product that's going to multiple locations. Normally, if you need to have product specifications that are unique to a geography, you will create a separate product because you need to have a separate model number and you need to be able to show that that product is unique to the other one. Now, that being said, I think where the question really lies is if there are claims or there are intended uses that are not going to be, that are either up-classified in another geography or are not something that the company's wanting to make in a specific geography, that doesn't mean that the DHF and the technical file changes. All it means is that in the DMR and some of the unique documents such as the IFU labeling, those may be unique. And you will have to create another product variant to show segregation of those two geographies because effectively you can't give that product. So let's say you have a product with a certain IFU in Europe and you try to bring that into Australia and it's not the same that you've applied to the TGA with, that's going to be a problem. So you have to make sure that you have uniqueness when it comes to that product variant. But when it comes to the overall product specifications, you can leave those high level. It's just that the downstream documents, such as your IFU, such as verification, validation activities, may be specific to meeting the requirements of a specific geography.
Fantastic. Thanks, TJ. Look, I think we're going to wrap it up. There is a couple of questions here that were sent through earlier, which I think just again to come back to around the IVDR. Again, we will be doing a webinar and some blogs on that in the not too distant future, so keep an eye out for that. With that, always, all of our webinars are recorded and available on the website. Be sure to follow us on our various social media links. We also have our First Tuesday newsletter, which is free, comes out on the first Tuesday of each month, so be sure to sign up for that. TJ, I want to say thank you very much for sharing this valuable information with everybody, and I'd also like to thank all of the attendees today. If you have any questions or we haven't gotten to your question, we will definitely be coming back to you shortly. But thank you very much for joining, and keep an eye out for our next upcoming webinar in June.
Yeah, thank you all for joining.